Hey guys, welcome back to the studio for another lesson. This week, I'm going to be taking you through a handful of lines that can help get you through both short and long minor 2/5s. Now, this is such an essential part of jazz language, so to make sure you guys can really dig deep on these, I'll demonstrate each line for you, and then we'll do an in-depth breakdown of the theory behind each phrase. You guys ready? Let's get started. I've spent a lot of time showing you guys tactics for playing over 2/5s in major keys, but we haven't spent quite as much time going over those same strategies for playing over minor 2/5. Today we're going to work towards fixing this discrepancy, since being able to play over minor 2/5s is equally important to becoming a good soloist. In this first batch of phrases that we'll go over in just a sec, I'll be demonstrating lines over the short version of the progression. That is, when the half diminished and the dominant chord both get shoved into the same bar. And we can make use of a lot of different strategies for playing over this, but you know me, being a huge fan of Barry Harris's ideas, we're going to be more or less ignoring the two chords here and just playing stuff that sounds like G7, resolving to C minor. And check out this first short phrase and then we'll break it down together. Simple lines like this are essential tools when building our vocabulary for playing over changes like this. And let's take a closer look and see how this phrase breaks down. When playing over half diminished chords, I typically think in dominant scales because it just makes more sense in my head. So for D half diminished, I'm thinking about a B flat 7 scale. Now from the fifth of a B flat 7, I ran down the scale to the third of the G. From there, we'll go up a diminished arpeggio, which is a really common strategy for playing over altered dominants, and then use a page from the Barry Harris chromatic scale and use a half step to resolve down to the fifth of C minor. From here, I went down A half diminished, which is just an inversion of a C minor 6, and pivoted to the 11th. And then I resolved into the third on the upbeat and into the phrase. Here's another short phrase that also resolves into the fifth of C minor. This time, rather than using a diminished arpeggio, we'll instead use a melodic cell that can get us to the same place. Check out the phrase and then we'll break down how it works. I'm thinking along the same lines for this lick as I did for the last one, but the way I decided to get to C minor could be justified in a couple of different ways. Let's take a look at the phrase in depth now. This one starts out pretty simple in that I'm just going down a D half diminished arpeggio from the 7th. Once I get down to the root, I'll pivot and go up to the third of a G. And then I'm thinking about this cell as coming out of the B flat half whole diminished scale. You could also view it as coming from tritones minor if you wanted to fit it into a more Barry-centric framework, but all roads lead to the same place in this case. I'm really just using the last note of that cell as a delay of the resolution to this G, which is the fifth of the C minor. Once I get there, I'll come down a C minor scale and then pivot to go up the chord from the fifth in melodic minor and end the phrase on the 9th. Let's check out one more short phrase before we move on to employing these concepts over long 2/5s. In this one, we'll make use of some more dominant family and an enclosure to kick things off. Here's the phrase for you to take a listen to, and then we'll break things down in depth. If you've seen my video on enclosures or learned some of my recent etudes, you'll probably have recognized the melodic cell that this line starts out with. Let's break down the whole thing and see how it works in depth. In this phrase, we'll start off the third of our D half diminished, and then play this enclosure cell to get to the root of a G. From there, we'll pivot and go up the chord, and then resolve to the third of C minor. Once we resolve, we'll use 2 half steps from Barry's chromatic scale to get down to the root. And then jump down to the natural 6 to end the phrase. I can't stress enough how important it is to have a bunch of ways that you can navigate short 2/5s like this in both minor and major. And not only is having more vocabulary just a net benefit all on its own, but it can also improve your sense of melody when you really internalize phrases like this. That's why in the PDF for this week's lesson, there's a ton of other phrases over short minor 2/5s for you guys to work through and incorporate into your own improvised lines. Up next, we'll take some of the same tactics we use for playing over these 2-bar phrases and extend them to play over long 2/5s. Before we do that though, I want to give a quick shout out to TRUEFIRE.com for supporting the channel. TRUEFIRE is an online lesson library that's host to literally thousands of courses on a wide range of musical topics from some really amazing artists and educators, including yours truly. If you're interested in improving your comping, make sure to check out my course, Exploring Melodic Jazz Comping, available on TRUEFIRE now. In this course, I'll demonstrate and break down 17 essential comping approaches using TRUEFIRE's interactive learning tools. We'll work on crafting more sophisticated comping parts using drop-2 voicing, chord substitutions, approach chords, diminished concepts, and voice leading. We'll also dive into triadic approaches, partial chords, using scales as chords, and the art of borrowing notes and dominants. You'll learn how these melodic comping approaches can be artistically applied using backing tracks based on the changes to popular jazz standards like Autumn Leaves, There'll Never Be Another You, and All the Things You Are. The link to the course is in the description of this video. Now let's get back to the lesson and see how we can apply this type of language to some phrases that work over long 2/5. When you're working out bebop language over jazz standards, you won't only come across short 2/5s. You're also going to encounter a lot of situations where you'll need to extend the language I just showed you and play it over the space of 2 bars before resolving to tonic minor. In these next 3 phrases, I'm going to show you some examples of how I like to play this sort of thing. Here's the first one for you to take a listen to, and then we'll break it down together. That phrase has a lot of the same DNA as the ones we went over in the last section. Like I said, we're really just trying to extend the language we're employing to get from dominant to tonic. Let's break this line down and see how it works in depth. Starting out off the end of 1, I did an enclosure around the flat 5 of D half diminished, before pivoting and then going up the chord in melodic minor. From there, I resolved and then went down a B flat 7 scale to the 3rd of a G. Then I pivoted and went up the chord. I resolved that down to the 5th of a C, and then did an enclosure around the natural 6, and then went up that chord. This time I resolved up, and then went down using 1/2 step to the 3rd, before jumping down to the root to finish the phrase. If you're really trying to internalize this language, I'd recommend you try playing with different resolutions from the pivots or arpeggios. That's a great way to change the direction of a line and give yourself a new puzzle to solve. Here's another phrase for you guys to check out that leans a little heavier on diminished and melodic minor sounds. I hope by now you're getting a feel for how I tend to think of lines over minor 2/5 and the kind of sounds that I like to lean into so that the changes come through clear in my phrases. Let's break this one down and see how it functions. From the 3rd of D half diminished, I did a pivot and then went up the chord. Here I'm really thinking about B flat 7, so I went down the scale from the 3rd of B flat, or the root of D, and used 1/2 step to get to the flat 7 on the next downbeat. That flat 7 is functioning here as the flat 9th of G, so I decided to think in A flat whole half diminished for some added tension. I ran up that scale to the 5th of G, then went up the chord, and used a 1/2 step from Barry's chromatic concept to get down to the flat 7th of C. From there, I went down the chord and pivoted to the 6, before coming down the scale to the 3rd of a C minor with 1/2 step. Off the 3rd, I did a little turn and then used one more 1/2 step to get down to the root, and then leapt down to the 6 to finish the phrase. let's check out one more phrase before we wrap things up for today. If you're looking for more of this type of language, though, don't forget to head over to my Patreon page. I've included a bunch of extra examples in the PDF for today's lesson for you guys to work through and incorporate into your own playing. Here's the last phrase for you to check out now. Pivoting in odd places like this is probably one of my favorite things to practice doing. Among other things, like enclosures and added half steps, it can really help give your lines a sense of forward motion. Here's how that line works in depth. Starting on beat 2 from the flat 5 of D half diminished, I pivoted and went up the chord thinking about B flat 7. When I got to this B flat, I went down the scale using 1 half step to get to the flat 7th in the downbeat of the next bar. Now, this A flat is functioning as flat 9, so I decided to use some more Barry Harris chromatics and use 2 half steps to get to the flat 7th of G on beat 3. Then I pivoted and went up the chord thinking about the tritones minor. I resolved that up a third into the 5th of a C, then came down the scale to the 3rd. From there, I did another pivot and went up the chord in melodic minor, and used 1 half step to get back down to the 3rd again on the next downbeat. Finally, I came down a triad in C minor 6, and then used 1 half step to get to the 5th, before jumping down to the root to end the phrase. Thanks so much for sticking around all the way to the end of the video. Now let me know in the comments what you guys thought of these phrases. I figured it might be a nice change of pace from the density of the last handful of videos to switch things up and just teach you guys some language that you can immediately put to use in your improvisations. As always, if you did find today's lesson helpful, make sure you give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that bell for notifications too. If you want to access the PDF for today's lesson, you can grab that, along with the whole back catalog for all the videos on the channel, for as little as $10 a month over at my Patreon page, or by just hitting the join button right here on YouTube. A special thanks goes out to Ron Maestas, Alf Collins, Juan Doming, Ruthenio Fiuza, and Carlos Fernandez for being studio fans. I really appreciate the support. An extra special thanks is due to these studio members for their support as well. James O'Connor, S. Bruce 1234, Thomas Kletchafore, Martin Weigers, Robert Muldowney, Mark Eslick, Carol, Robert Allaire, Daniel Alvarenga, Robert Cody, Robert Berlin, Almoreni, Lambert, Gregory Chu, Vaughn Davis, Nick Hess, Lewis Maiden, Brendan Kelly, Stephen Moore, T. Colston, Andrew McBride, Aldo Fonseca, Jason Paul Dubois, Ron Askew, Lawrence Beer, Raymond Agloro, James Seabury, Bruce Wood, Bill Benfield, Benjamin Dockstader, Sean Lepore, Stephen White, Zalkai Zoltan, Apollos Jolivert, Justin Fisher, Milan de Kaiser, David Wertman, Zis Soares, Artie Sanchez, Louis Rosen, Stephen Prager, Aaron Walters, Skemster, Everton Armstrong, Stephen Schwartz, Max Irwin, Patrick Caron, David Zuckerbrun, and PH. An extra special shout out goes out to Jazz Luminaire patron Bill Jacob. Thank you guys all so much for your continued support. I'm David Shore, and thanks again for hanging out with me at the studio today. I'll see you guys next time.